So welcome to the Herland report, Mr. Phil Giraldi. You are a counterterrorism specialist and a military intelligence officer with the CIA. You used to work with the CIA for many years. Your degrees from the University of Chicago, and you have been working overseas for over 20 years for the United States in the work of counter-terrorism actions. We find your views particularly interesting in explaining what is currently going on geopolitically as well as pertaining to national security in the United States. Look, from the 1990s we've had the development really and the implementation of a globalist kind of economic international system that departs from the nation-based capitalist structure with the strong borders and each nation being a sovereign state. And we see this new type of world order has led to the remarkable rise of an ultra-rich elite. I think Oxfam now states approximately 60 persons, individuals in the world, own more than 50% of world assets. What kind of impact does this have on democracy and our systems?
Well, the simple answer to what you're saying, or what you're asking, is that it basically is completely destructive of a democratic, pluralistic, and nationalistic structure which dominated in the world for most of the 20th century. Globalism basically means that the old benchmarks for what constituted threats and national interests have more or less disappeared, and there are new threats and interests that have been contrived by the globalists. And this has meant in practice that globalism, as it is exercised by the people who are the elites or the establishment in many countries, have transferred wealth to themselves, transferred political power to themselves, and have essentially made it that they are the ones dictating what are the interests of the various countries and what has to be done to support their own interests.
And it's peculiar too, because when you look at that transnational, international business model, when you're outsourcing jobs to China, for example, or India, there is no redistribution of wealth back to the country from which the jobs were taken, which is the situation for the U.S. today.
Yeah, that's right. There's always been this myth, it's always been a myth, that there is a trickle down in economics, where when people at the top of the system make a lot of money, it all comes down to the people, eventually to the people below, and the people below get a share of that. Now that worked when you had nations or you had closed communities that had industries that were local, because the money stayed locally. And now the difference is that the money goes outside the system, and the people who lose their jobs forever. And so there is no trickle down. I think Ronald Reagan was the one who actually coined the expression trickle down economics. And so we don't see that happening anymore, because the money is fungible, and it moves offshore, it moves to other places, and it is used to further the interests of the elites, of the establishment, in terms of what their own interests, rather than the interests of the people in the country.
As well, we saw when Donald Trump initially took office, one of the elements he spoke about was that he wanted to stop the tax havens, because one of the elements within this kind of globalist structure, and the borderlessness that it's depending on, borderless societies, is that then where are you going to pay tax? So you end up establishing yourself in a way that you don't pay taxes anywhere.
Yeah, well, as we've just seen recently, the richest man in the world paid no taxes last year on income of $10 billion. Mr. Bezos, who owns the Washington Post and Amazon. So this was a myth that Donald Trump was describing. He saw the loss of jobs, the loss of economic viability in the communities in the United States as a problem with jobs being exported to Mexico or exported to China or exported to Vietnam. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that the whole global economic system is now no longer national. It's not a question of people getting jobs. It's a question of basically how the people at the top of the system manipulate the economy to benefit themselves. And it's if Donald Trump cuts a deal with Mexico, that's meaningless because the people who are able to control the economic factors will go somewhere else. And when they go somewhere else, they will then go somewhere else after that. So it's a poor understanding by Donald Trump, who styles himself as a businessman, of how exactly the markets work today.
Pertaining to globalists, one may say, such as George Soros, I know you've been doing some work on him as well, because it's remarkable to see that when you study the George Soros Foundation and the initial speeches you find on his webpage, these are wonderful statements of the belief in democracy and the sharing of the wealth with everybody.
Yeah, George Soros is a particular example. He may have been one of the first of the real globalists who saw that economics did not live separate from politics. And so George sets up foundations, he sets up institutes, and these institutes actually interfere with democracy in the countries they get involved in. And we're seeing that, we have seen it recently with the case of Ukraine. We see a lot of activity by George Soros in Eastern Europe. And essentially, he is interested in interfering in the politics because he knows that when you get rid of the forces of democracy of the people, you can manipulate the elites, because the elites are only interested in money. So George Soros is constantly seeking to promote what he calls democracy, but it's a democracy, it's more like an oligarchy. And the oligarchs all know each other. And the oligarchs all have a common interest, which is essentially the 50, 60 people you were talking about, to continue their domination of the global economy. It's not a national economy anymore, it's a global economy.
Let's get into Ukraine. What was George Soros' role in Ukraine? We all remember the Maidan, that later turned out to be fire shots from other angles than what was initially reported. And
yeah. Well, George Soros, as I indicated before, essentially was involved in setting up foundations and groups that were unfriendly to the existing government, which in turn was friendly to Russia and was creating problems for Soros and his other establishment people, because they wanted to have access to government in a way that they could manipulate it. And by getting rid of the government, which had been democratically elected, they were able to bring in a government that they have considerable control over. And I would add the United States State Department played a big role in this too, because governments in some places, United States and Britain would be two prime examples, have very much become globalist in terms of how the elites in the government respond. Bill Clinton was a globalist when he was president of the United States, essentially, and cashed in after he ceased being president. And his wife continued to work as a globalist when she was Secretary of State. So we have that. Tony Blair. These are people that all have been co-opted by the system that George Soros and others have set up.
Speaking about Hillary Clinton, it's such a paradox that you introduce into the American system through the rise of the Clinton Foundation, some sort of pay for play, which was an element that was prohibited by law, I do believe, in the United States before, in order to stop the corruption in the government and in Congress.
Yeah. Well, it was clever the way the Clintons played that. The revolving door, they call it in Washington, where people leave the government and then take a job with a private company that is involved in the same business that they had when they were in government, is prohibited for a number of years, 5 years in many cases. But if you don't go to something that's similar, you're free. You're free to go make a speech, and someone will pay you whatever they think it's worth. Bill Clinton made speeches for $250,000, $500,000, I believe in one case $750,000, $750,000. So he was not necessarily promoting the interests of a company or a corporation. He was going and making a speech. So he abided by the rules, but he manipulated what the rules were. And meanwhile, his wife, of course, claimed that she had nothing to do with the foundation because she was still in the government, and yet she maintained as a separate email account which mixed government business, foundation business, and personal business all together. And she's never been held accountable for any of this.
How come?
Well, because the United States government is corrupt is the simple answer. Everyone is in it for the money. Not everyone. There are 5 or 6 exceptions in the government among Congress and the White House, but most of them are they ultimately believe that they are entitled. These are entitled people in government. And probably every country is a little bit like that. But in the United States, it's a lot like that. And as soon as these people leave the government, they figure out ways to cash in, to make their government time profitable for their retirement or however they choose to define it.
If you want to run for Congress, you can be entirely funded by various corporations or lobby groups, big pharma, oil and gas, whatever. Then when you are elected, there's no restriction on you amending bills or participating in changing the structure in such a way that it would profit precisely the groups that funded you to enter Congress in the first place. And thirdly, you are also, as a congressman or congresswoman, there's no problem in you owning stocks or amending bills with having the potential to have those stocks soar, being funded by precisely the same corporations that you are amending, and potentially for you to then earn a lot of money from the rising of those stocks. Is this a correct perception?
It is an absolutely correct perception, except your first step is too nice. It is essential for someone running for Congress to have that kind of support. So it's not an option. It's something that they have to have. And so they go and look for the people who have the money, who then make the rest of the process work, where they buy the congressman right in the beginning, and from that point on, the congressman is owned. And this is an unfortunate aspect of American democracy, if you want to call it that. The fact is, you need money to run for Congress. And to get the money, you have to go to someone who has the money. And someone who has the money has an interest in letting you have some of his money. So that's how it works.
So to what degree is the American system really a democratic system, if that is how it works?
I think the simple answer is that the American system is no longer a democracy. It's a controlled democracy. And the democracy is basically controlled. Well, people refer to the deep state or the establishment. And those are convenient expressions. That means where the money is, where the power is, and where the government goes to get its directions and how it's told what it should do.
Again, returning to the question of a pay for play, because Judicial Watch, of course, came out in 2015, I do believe it was, with the report showing that the Clinton Foundation received large sums from foreign states.
Right.
And this, of course, spills into the prop of national security and homeland security for the United States as well. My particular interest is that the three main states that paid into the Clinton Foundation was Norway, the Qatar of Europe, the oil-rich Qatar of Europe, from which we come from. Then was the Saudi Arabia, understandably enough, the leading ally to the United States. And the third state was Qatar. How do you explain Norway's role into this?
I've always been intrigued by Norway's role in bankrolling the Clintons. There probably is a connection. I have never seen it explained in very clear terms. The connection with Saudi Arabia and Qatar is very clear. The United States provides all kinds of benefits to the Saudis, Qataris, and Israelis in that region, and it's a quid pro quo.
It's interesting to see such a small state of only 6 million people being so involved in these kinds of power plays, and also to note that such an unproportionate high degree of Norwegian officials then are being appointed into the central positions in the UN-based and American-dominated structures such as NATO and you know, I mean, it's
World
just
Bank, perhaps.
Yes, it's and WHO, a number of these organizations, and of course, just in attempting to look at how the de-democratization process is being done in the Western nations. We recently had one of our prime ministers, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was prime minister in Norway for a number of years. Maybe our first globalist prime minister, after she headed on to leading the WHO and has done that for a number of years and leading positions within that system. And she's an older woman now, and she came back to Norway recently, and she stated bluntly up front, in front of the leading media, saying that we are so sad that we are beginning to lose our control over what the public is being told. And this sentence was all over the media, many of them maybe not realizing what a blunt mistake that was of her to put it out so honestly.
Brutal. Well, I think that you have your answer there. I think there is obviously a quid pro quo in terms of the elite in your own country talking to the elite in the United States and Britain, and essentially coming to understandings which maybe are not written down on paper and are just, as the Italians would say, a quattro occhi, just between us. And so the elite people, the establishment people, they talk in a different language. They understand each other. They don't even have to say anything because their interests are global. Their interests are in terms of maintaining their status and to maintain the system that supports them. So that is why things work the way they work. In the United States now, for example, Donald Trump, when he was running for president, promised to end the wars in the Middle East. Now we've seen that when he tries to do it, there are problems with that. This is because the establishment is very powerful. It has its people in the Pentagon, in the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, in the justice system, in Congress, both parties. These people all understand. They understand the language. They understand what they're saying to each other, even without saying it. And this is the way they work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phil Giraldi, for taking the time to joining us here at the Herland Report in discussing these various matters that are so important to the development in the West.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.